Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations. We are in the midst of our study of Maimonides' Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the Rambam, his laws of the chosen house, laws of the building of the Holy Temple. And actually, we are nearing the end of the first chapter. And we have now a number of halachot which deal with the topic of the altar. Various requirements of the stones of the altar, some interesting details pertaining to the altar. And in fact, as we're going to see, the entire second chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the next chapter that we're going to begin when we conclude this one, is all about taken up with the subject of the altar. And as we'll see, the altar is the most important facet, really, the most important point in the Holy Temple. The majority of the divine service that takes place there in the temple takes place either on or around the altar. And I don't want to give away too much at this point. We're going to see, as I know many of you are already aware, that the altar has tremendous significance from the very beginning of time. So that the details that we're studying now, as far as many fine-tuned requirements, even as far as the stones that are used to build the altar and the ramp, these are not just small components of a subject. These are so important because the altar has tremendous significance in the whole thought process of the master of the universe, as it were. In fact, we are taught in the Talmud that the concept of the divine service that takes place in the temple was a primordial thought, was something that even predated the creation of the world, that God, as it were, considered and contemplated, thought about what takes place in the Holy Temple. And those type of teachings, what they point to is the fact that the relationship that is clarified, that is rectified, that is amplified, the relationship between man and God that takes place in the Holy Temple, that really is the purpose of everything that goes on in the temple. It is the fine-tuning, again, of our relationship with God. And so much of that has to do with the divine service in the temple. Now, one of the questions that people ask very often, whenever we study about, on this level of detail, about the temple, particularly about the altar, many people feel that we're so out of touch with the understanding of what happened there and how the offerings were conducted and the whole topic of the sacrifices, a word that is a bit difficult to use, and we'll see why. Many people, they ask, are we really going to be going back to the sacrificial system in the temple? Are we really going to be bringing animals to the altar again? Is that not out of date? Is that not something that was perhaps allowed at that time because of man's primitive nature or because of the situation at that time? And aren't we way past that? And all of these questions really deserve to be dealt with, I think, in a separate session. And we're going to do one session, I think, of our series just on the more esoteric aspect, or if you will, even the philosophical aspect of what the concept of bringing the offerings in the temple really is all about. And that really is not the purpose of these general lessons that we're doing in Hilchot Beit HaBechira. As we're just going forward, we are also mentioning other sources. We're citing other sources and some of the more homiletical texts as well, because I think it gives us more of a holistic picture of the whole idea. But in general, our goal in these lessons now is to be quite occupied with the basic, rudimentary, even physical requirements of the building of the temple, because it is a very real thing. It is a very physical concept, and that, of course, as we've emphasized many times, is one of the most important, central, and really beautiful ideas of Torah practice, Torah Judaism, the fact that God so much loves this world, that everything in it can be elevated to use for Him and sanctified. So the temple is a very physical place, and it's not a metaphysical place. It's a meeting, a portal, as it were, between the divine and the physical. But there is a lot of noise there. There are animals that are being offered on the altar. There's blood. There's smoke. And look around in the world today. Those are factors of our life. and there's no getting away from that. But the idea is, where do all these things go? What is the power behind all of them? How do we rectify the various levels of endeavor that are part of our world? And that's really what goes on in the temple. So we're going to talk more about the significance of the altar, and as I mentioned, the next chapter is totally taken up with the altar in the Holy Temple, and we're just getting ready for that kind of now with these last number of laws in the first chapter. So bear in mind that our approach at the moment, at this particular moment, is going to be through the laws that Maimonides records. There is so much that we need yet to discuss regarding the altar in the Holy Temple, which in many ways can really be compared to the heart of the whole world of the Holy Temple. The heart that beats at its center is the altar. And what goes on there has tremendous repercussions for Israel and for the whole world. So in the 14th halacha, entry number 14, in the first chapter of Maimonides, Hilchot Beit HaBechira, we are studying more about the altar. Kol even shenifkama kidei shetachkor ba hatziporin kisakin shel shchita harei zo psula lakebesh v'lamizbeach. As we mentioned very briefly in our last program, every stone that is a stone in the altar, and in fact the stone in the altar or the ramp leading up to the altar, which becomes blemished, becomes invalid for use, whether in the altar itself or in the ramp leading up to the altar. As it says, there is a verse which we can see here in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 27, that tells us that the stones that Hashem requires us to use to build the altar are whole stones. And there is a particular prohibition that we understand based on this concept, based on this verse, that these stones have to be untouched by metal. That's something that we're going to study about more now. And these stones have to be whole, unblemished stones. Now, the first thing that we mentioned here, as we see here in this depiction, the idea of the thumbnail. The idea of the nail, this is very interesting because this is actually the same idea as applies to the checking of the knife that is used for shchita. The sakin, the knife that is used to slaughter an animal for consumption in the kosher way, as required by the revelation that Hashem gave to Moshe at Mount Sinai. The shchita, the slaughtering of an animal in the kosher way, requires that the knife be absolutely perfect and without blemish. And the laws relating to exactly how a kosher animal is to be butchered in the kosher manner are quite complicated, and the requirements are many. And the shochet, who is the ritual slaughterer, who is the one who is responsible for providing the meat for the community, has indeed tremendous amount of responsibility on his shoulders and must be very familiar with exactly how this is to be done. And one of the interesting ideas is that the knife that is used has to be so perfect and smooth and without blemish, smooth meaning sharp, that one of the ways that he can check it is by actually running it against his thumbnail. And if there is the slightest catch or nick in the blade, then the nail will catch on that little, almost infinitesimal indentation, and he will feel that. And that would render that knife to be invalid. And this is another subject altogether regarding the concept of the kosher slaughtering and how it is ultimately the most humane manner of slaughtering an animal that is known to man. Interestingly, the same idea here of the nail catching in a nick is the same amount of what's called a pagam, a blemish that could actually render one of the stones of the altar or its ramp, the ramp leading up to the altar, because of the prohibition against climbing up the altar by way of stairs, which we're going to study more about soon. That much of a blemish would be enough to render that stone unfit. And as we'll see, it would have to be uprooted. Continuing here in this particular halacha, number 14, Umehechan hayu mivi'in avnei mizbeach. Where were the stones of the altar procured? From where were the stones of the altar brought? Min bitulat hakarka. And Maimonides answers, they were brought from the depths of the earth. They were quarried from a place where we can be certain that no metal ever touched. They were removed from the earth without metal. Chofrin ad shemagiin lemakom hanikar she'eno makom avoda ubinyan. They would dig down to a place where it was recognizable that in this place there had never been any sort of building or construction activity. Umotziin mimenu ha'avanim. And from there they would remove the stones. O min hayam hagadol. And alternatively, also stones were taken at times from the ocean floor. Stones that were obviously never involved or touched by man. And metal, that is. Ubonin mehen, and these were used for the construction. Similarly, v'chein avnei ha'hechal v'ha'azarot shlemot hayu. Also, Maimonides tells us, the stones that were used to construct the sanctuary itself and the courts of the sanctuary were whole stones. But there are several things that are going on here at once, so we don't want to get confused. There are two things that we're mentioning. We're mentioning requirements regarding the stones for the altar and the ramp, and stones that are also used for the temple structure in general. And in both cases, there are ways in which these stones can become unfit for use. So, first of all, in dealing with the subject of the altar and its ramp, we have a particular tradition that we derive that the stones that are used for the altar and the ramp have to be whole stones, and they cannot have any blemish whatsoever. And interestingly, in the Talmud, there are different opinions regarding how much of a nick is considered to be a blemish. And basically, there is an idea, I think this is the basic agreement that our sages have. There are two different sizes. There is this that are in question. There is the size of a hand breadth, which is a measurement that is used a great deal in Jewish law, a tefach, a hand breadth, and then there is the size of an olive. And basically, the Talmud tells us that if there would be a hole in a stone, which would be as deep as a hand breadth, that stone would be unfit for use. Whereas if there would be a blemish in the plaster between the stones and the coating on the stones, merely the size of an olive, that would be unfit. So the category, the classification that Maimonides tells us regarding the checking of the stone with the thumbnail, that actually applies to a stone itself, to one particular stone. In other words, once the altar is built of stones, and somehow in between the stones there is a hole which is deeper, that would have to be replaced. And so too when it comes to the plastering. But regarding each individual stone and the necessity to possibly replace it, that would be mandated by a blemish, even which would be sufficient merely to catch the nail. Now, the difference here is, and follow this idea, the difference is that one stone which would have a blemish that would catch the nail would render that particular stone to be invalid, so that stone would have to be uprooted and replaced. But a blemish in the surface of the altar, the size of a tefach, of a hand breadth, would render the entire altar to be unfit. So that the idea here is that the stone with the scratch, as it were, the hair's breadth we can call it, the blemish that would catch the nail, the altar can still be used, but that stone must be replaced. But if there is a deeper blemish in the altar, then the entire altar would have to be on hold until that particular problem could be fixed. Interestingly also, I'd like to point out that the idea of the ramp is something that the rabbis derive. We can find this in the Mishnah and tractate Midot. Actually, the verse seems to indicate that the necessity for whole stones only applies to the altar itself. And this is the verse, for example, that we point out from the book of Deuteronomy, Avanim shlemot tivna et mizbach Hashem. Only from whole stones shall you build the altar of God. However, Maimonides here is basically incorporating the tradition which our sages have already derived in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, tractate Midot, where they basically determine that the same prohibition also would apply to the ramp itself. So neither the stones in the ramp leading up to the altar, nor the stones in the altar themselves may have any of these types of blemishes. Regarding the stones that are used in the sanctuary itself, Maimonides here also reflects a verse which I believe we've discussed before regarding King Solomon, where we find in the book of Kings that we have a description of the stones that were used in the building of the temple itself, and these stones also were required to be whole. Now, we mentioned earlier that there are several prohibitions involving metal and the stones that are used for the temple. So we want to remember exactly what this is referring to. We have a particular verse that we cited earlier, which indicates to us that the sound of metal was not to be heard at the site of the temple while the temple was being built. And that particularly refers to the stones that are used in the sanctuary itself, because the metal may be used for the stones that are used in the sanctuary. However, those stones are quarried, cut, and prepared off-site, and then they are brought to be used in the temple building. And this is something that we've discussed, so we can see here again the depiction of how the stones were prepared at the time of the building of the temple in an artist's conception, and these stones were brought to the site. So metal can be used on the stones in the temple building and in the courts of the temple. However, it just can't be heard at the site. However, metal may not touch any of the stones that are used in the altar or in its ramp. And we shall soon see that not only are we talking about metal which could blemish the stone by actually making a nick which would be felt and which could be seen, or perhaps making a hole which could be seen. That certainly would render one of the stones of the altar or its ramp unfit. But the mere touching of metal to any of those stones would also render it unfit. This is what the Torah is teaching us. Even if there is not a blemish created that is visible to the eye or that can be felt by the nail or by some other means of testing, the very presence of metal that would come in any contact, however superficially, with any of the stones of the altar or its ramp would render that stone to be unfit. So, continuing into the 15th halacha in chapter 1, we are taught avnei hechal va'azarot shenifgamu o shenigmamu psulin ve'ein lahen pidyon ela nignazim. The Rambam tells us that any of the stones at all that were used in the sanctuary or in any of the building of the temple, in the courts of the temple, if those stones became somehow blemished or invalidated, those stones cannot be, the word is pidyon, they cannot be redeemed. In other words, there is no rectification, there is no way to right the situation if one of the stones in the wall of the temple became invalid. We have to see exactly, is that similar to what we learned about the altar and its ramp? Is it a question of metal? What invalidates a stone actually in the wall? If a stone in the temple building became blemished, it would have to be removed. It cannot be redeemed, is actually the word that's used in halacha. It cannot be in any way, its value cannot be reinstated, and its perfection cannot be reinstated. However, since these stones had actually been sanctified because of their role in the building of the temple, they are also not discarded. Rather, they must be kept separately, and basically the concept is that they have to be nignaz, means that they basically have to be hidden away. The word comes from the root for something which is hidden. They have to be stored in a respectful manner. They cannot be thrown away. Similarly, many of our viewers are familiar with the fact that if we have something that possesses a degree of holiness, like a parchment that was used for a mezuzah or for the tefillin or a Sefer Torah itself, if these items became invalid, they cannot simply be thrown away. They have to be handled in a way that still conveys the utmost respect and sanctity of the item, but they are going to have to be hidden away in a respectful way, and then possibly they can be either buried, or there are other options sometimes. But similarly, we find the same word when it comes to these stones of the temple. They have to be hidden. So Maimonides continues and tells us, Kol Evin Shenagaba Habarzel Afal Pi Shelo Nifkama Psula Lebinyan HaMizbeach Uvinyan HaKevesh. As we already know, as we've already discussed, any stone which has been touched at all by metal, even though, as I just mentioned earlier, the stone wasn't blemished and no scratch or nick was created by touching the stone, the very fact that metal touched the stone that is in use, or that is to be used for the altar or its ramp, would render that invalid. And that is something which is learned from the verse in the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, Ki charbacha henafta aleha vatachal aleha. By the sword, the stone of the altar is rendered invalid, and our rabbis teach us that the altar, on a symbolic level, and this is again something that in the next chapter we're going to be talking about at great length, the altar is a device which prolongs the life of man. In other words, because the altar brings about a state of peace, as it were, this is the expression of our sages, brings about a harmony between man and God, it is not fitting, it is not proper, it doesn't seem right that metal, which is the sword, the symbol of war, which is the tool that basically shortens a man's life, doesn't seem right that metal should be used on the altar, which lengthens the life of a man. Actually, our sages have a very beautiful teaching about this whole concept, and they say, if this is how sensitive we are to be regarding the stones of the altar, which do not see and do not hear and have no feelings, but yet because the altar is considered by the Torah to be something that brings about a state of rectification between man and God, yet we're supposed to be so careful about, as it were, the altar's feelings, so too, how much more so when it comes to a person who brings about peace between people, between man and wife, between man and his friend, how much we have to be cognizant of them and grateful to them, and how careful we have to be with our colleagues and our friends and those around us who also bring about a state of peace. So the major difference here between the stones of the altar and its ramp and the stones of the temple itself is as follows. The major principle, the single largest difference, is that the stones of the altar and its ramp can be rendered unfit merely by the touch of metal, whereas the stones of the heichal, the stones of the sanctuary itself, would be rendered unfit only by an actual hole or something that would happen. In other words, if there is some damage that is caused to a wall in the temple, then a stone already set in the wall of the temple which would become damaged, that stone would have to be replaced, as we said, cannot be redeemed, would have to be hidden away. But it is not really similar to the concept of the stones of the altar, which could be rendered unfit merely by the touch of metal. Those stones would have to actually be damaged somehow in order for them to be rendered unfit. In the temple, actually, this is a very interesting idea, because as Maimonides tells us here in Halacha Tetvav, in the 15th Halacha, the stones that became unfit would have to be hidden away. Actually, there was one particular chamber in the temple in the time of the Chashmonaim, the time of the Maccabees, and we're coming actually close now to the time of Hanukkah on the Jewish calendar. There was a chamber in which the stones that had become blemished were actually kept. And we are taught that that chamber was actually one of the chambers that was located in the place of the hearth, which we can see here is actually one of the chambers in the northern wall of the inner court of the temple. In the place of the hearth, there were a number of additional smaller chambers. And as we see here, in this particular chamber, which was actually called the Chamber of the Seals, S-E-A-L-S, it was a chamber in which those who came to the temple to bring personal offerings would purchase a seal in this chamber corresponding to the amount that they needed for their libations that were brought together with the offering. They would get the seal, and then they would go and get what they needed for the libations of their offering. And there, in that very chamber, the stones that had been rendered unfit by the invaders, by the Greeks who desecrated the temple in the time of the Chashmonaim, the Maccabees, those stones were actually kept in this chamber, and they were not discarded. So we're going to be continuing in our next installment of Light to the Nations with the laws pertaining to the altar which is at the center of everything in the temple and brings about the state of excellence and the resting of the divine presence in the temple, the light to Israel and the light to the nations.